Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Uplifted Hand. Today we are going to go over Psalm chapter 77, 78, 85, and 86, and this is the last video of the week, so let's get into it. So in Psalm 77, we have a new voice, and this is Asaph speaking. And honestly, it's a new person, but it has the same problem, or he has the same problem. He is in deep trouble. He says he prayed all night with his hands lifted towards heaven, but his soul still wasn't comforted. And then he remembers what life used to feel like. He basically says, I remember when my nights were filled with joyful songs. What happened? And then came the scary questions. Has God rejected me? Has his love disappeared? Has he forgotten to be gracious? This isn't someone who doesn't believe in God. This is someone who does believe in God and cannot understand why God feels so far away. And then Asaph does something important. He stops looking only at what he feels right now. Still in Psalm 77, verses 11 through 20, he remembers. He says, I recall all you have done, O Lord. And suddenly he starts going back through Israel's history, the Red Sea, the Exodus, Moses and Aaron. And remember, Asaph wasn't standing at the Red Sea when it happened. These were stories passed down to him. But when he cannot see what God is doing now, he remembers what God has done before. And I love this ending. You led your people along that road like a flock of sheep. The road was literally through a sea, which is not really the route I think anybody would have picked. But God made a road where they couldn't see one. And Psalm 78 is about to explain why remembering matters so much. So now we're in Psalm 78, verses 1 through 8, and it basically says, do not let the next generation forget this. Tell your children what God has done. Tell them about his power. Tell them about his miracles, and tell them how he rescued his people. Because the goal isn't just for our children to know Bible stories. Verse 7 says the goal is that they would put their hope in God. And this hits the come follow me message for this week. The Lord will help me in my time of need. How will the next generation know where to turn in their time of need? Partly because we tell them where God met us in ours, because Israel is about to show us what happens when people do forget. We're now in verses 17 through 38, and here we go. Israel has watched God provide for them, and they basically say, okay, sure, he made water come out of a rock, but can he give us bread and meat? Guys, he just made water come out of a rock. But that's the pattern of Psalm 78. God provides, they forget, they rebel, trouble comes back, they turn back. And then verse 38 says, yet he was merciful and forgave their sins. Not once, it says many times he held back his anger. And before we judge Israel too hard, this pattern should look a little familiar because we forget to. Okay, so in verses 40 through 57, Asaph starts bringing up some really old history. So let's break down what he's really talking about. Long before this psalm was written, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. God sent Moses to Pharaoh and told him to let his people go, and Pharaoh refused. So Egypt was hit with these enormous plagues. Water was turned to blood, frogs were everywhere, and swarms of flies came, and crops were destroyed. And eventually Pharaoh decided, okay, let's let the Israelites leave. And then when Pharaoh changed his mind and chased them, God literally parted the Red Sea so Israel could walk through it. And that is what Asaph is reminding everyone about. Because after everything God had done to rescue them, they still eventually turned away from him. And at first, whenever I was reading this, I was like, how? How do you forget the God who parted an entire sea for you? But then I started to think, well, they probably didn't forget that it happened. They forgot what it meant. They stopped letting what God had done before change how they trusted him now. And that is why Asaph keeps telling them to remember, not just remember the miracle, but remember the God who did it. So now we're in verses 52, then 70 through 72. And after all of that rebellion, we have to look at what God does. He led his own people like a flock of sheep. He kept leading them. And then he chose David, not some polished, powerful ruler. He's a shepherd, a regular man out with a sheep. And verse 72 says, David cared for them with a true heart and led them with skillful hands. And that's a beautiful ending to this giant history lesson. Israel repeatedly failed God. God did not repeatedly abandon Israel. And now the Psalms shifts from remembering what God did before to asking him to restore them again. So now we're all the way in Psalm 85, and it's basically a prayer of God, you've restored us before, please do it again. And then we get this gorgeous line, unfailing love and truth have met together, righteousness and peace have kissed. Which is God's mercy isn't him pretending sin doesn't matter. His righteousness isn't him refusing mercy. In him, both exist. And I think that's why this follows Psalm 78 so beautifully, because Israel's story isn't they were good, so God loved them. It's they failed, God corrected, God forgave, God restored. And then we come back to David. We're now in Psalm 86, verses 1 through 11. David says, Bend down, O Lord, and hear my prayer. And I loved that wording because suddenly David didn't sound like a king to me. He sounded like a child looking up at his father saying, I need you down here. But then his prayer changes. He doesn't only say, fix this. He says, teach me your ways. And that's huge because sometimes the help we need isn't God immediately changing everything around us. Sometimes it's God changing and teaching us while we're in it. And that brings this entire week together. And this is where we end this week. David asks God to teach him, help him, and comfort him, which is kind of wild whenever you think about everything we've read, because these Psalms have been messy. People are scared, they're angry, they're questioning God, they're forgetting what he's done, and then they're coming back, and then they're wandering again. And honestly, I kept thinking, goodness, how many times are we going to do this? Because maybe that's exactly why I needed these scriptures. Because apparently needing God again doesn't mean we failed the lesson. Asaph needed him, Israel needed him, David needed him again and again and again. And that's what this week's Come Follow Me says. The Lord will help me in my time of need. Not if I have a time in need, when I do. And after everything we just read, I'm starting to think that that's the whole point. We keep needing him, and he keeps being God. And that's it for this week. Thank you for listening to The Uplifted Hand. We'll see you Sunday.